Hey everyone, here is a lecture on classical conditioning. It'll be the first of two lectures about our unit on behaviorism. So we'll have a lecture on classical conditioning, and then our next lecture will be about operant conditioning. And being able to kind of keep these two different concepts separate can be a little tricky. So, with classical conditioning, you may recall it started a long time ago with this Russian scientist named Ivan Pavlov. And he kind of stumbled across classical conditioning on accident. Pavlov was studying the digestive system in dogs, and he found that when he was walking in to feed his dogs, they were starting to salivate before he even put food in front of them. In other words, these dogs had apparently learned to do what would otherwise be considered a response or a reflex, almost like an impulse. And that's really the birth of classical conditioning. It's when we learn to do these uncontrollable, involuntary responses. And so when you're trying to differentiate between classical conditioning and classical conditioning, that's one key thing to look at. With classical conditioning, what you are learning, what you are being conditioned to do, is often considered involuntary. Again, it's like a reflex. Whereas with operant conditioning, in our next lecture, that with those responses, you have a choice of whether or not you want to do something for perhaps a reward, if you don't want to do something to try to avoid a punishment or something like that. So let's take a look at this chart here and kind of see how this works, because this sometimes gets confusing for students. We have lots of different terms involved with classical conditioning, but if you break them down, they kind of make sense. You want to remember that when we look at that word conditioning, what we really mean is learning or teaching or training. And so, what we have here in our first box, before any conditioning takes place, food would be considered an unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned in the sense that it doesn't have to be taught. And salivation would be considered an unconditioned response. In other words, if you put food in front of a dog, they're going to start to salivate, and that just makes perfect sense. You don't need to teach them to do that. Now, before conditioning, if you take something like a bell, for example, and you ring that bell in front of a dog's face, we wouldn't expect them to salivate because a bell is a neutral stimulus, right? So before conditioning, that second box, a bell is neutral. It doesn't have any natural response that is going to happen if you ring a bell. But during conditioning, that third box, what we do is we want to pair these stimuli together. You want to pair together an unconditioned stimulus like food with a neutral stimulus like a bell. And when you do that, the dog is going to salivate. In box three, the dog is salivating because it's getting food. But what that dog is also doing is it is learning to pair together these stimuli. And that really is the key to classical conditioning, is pairing together our stimuli. Um, as I wrote that, I noticed my typo. Let me see if I can keep it. You're going to have to bear with me all. That should say UCS. Otherwise, it's a college, USC. I apologize. There we are. So, our UCS is our unconditioned stimulus, and you want to recognize that we pair that together with our conditioned stimulus. Those two things, when they're paired together, is how we get classical conditioning. Then, over time, what can happen to box four, after conditioning has happened, then we can remove food, just ring a bell, and the dog is going to start to salivate. In other words, the dog has learned to salivate to the bell. And they've learned to do that because they are anticipating food. They believe that food is going to happen. And so, back to my kind of formula here, our unconditioned stimulus is going to produce an unconditioned response. These things happen naturally in the world. A conditioned stimulus will produce a conditioned response, but that has to be learned. And the only way for that to take place is, again, to pair together the stimuli. If you pair together food, which is our UCS, with a bell, which will become our CS, then over time that bell will produce a dog starting to salivate. So let's look at this chart here and how this works. You'll notice that along the bottom there with our x-axis, this is time passing. And then the y-axis, that's the strength of our conditioned response. And in the case of Pavlov, the conditioned response is salivating to the sound of the bell. Well, at the very beginning of this experiment, if you just ring a bell, there's not going to be some dog salivating over the sound of the bell. It's going to be very weak. But when you pair together the unconditioned stimulus of food with the neutral stimulus of the bell, that pairing is what we call acquisition. Acquisition is when you pair the stimuli. And continually pairing them together over and over and over and over again, this process of acquisition is going to strengthen the conditioned response of salivating. Then, when you take that unconditioned stimulus away, when you take away the food and you just have the bell, that kind of starts the process of extinction. Extinction is when the conditioned response goes away. And the conditioned response is going to go away if you continually experience the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus. So let's put some actual examples in there so that makes sense. A dog is going to salivate to the sound of a bell because it anticipates food following. But if you just keep ringing that bell over and over and over again, that bell is the conditioned stimulus. If you just keep ringing that bell over and over and over again without producing any food, the unconditioned stimulus, then over time, the dog's not going to salivate to the bell anymore. It's realized, oh, well, I guess this doesn't mean I'm getting food. So extinction is when that conditioned response goes away. Sometimes what can happen is once time has passed, maybe that's a few days, maybe that's a few weeks, right? A dog is hanging out just doing dog stuff, and then Pavlov comes by and rings a bell, the dog might start to salivate again. And this is what we call spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous recovery is when a conditioned response that had previously been extinct returns, right? It's when it returns, and then again, we would see extinction take place after that. So really the only thing I want to add to this is this terrifying picture of a hammer kind of behind this baby here. And it is the story of John Watson and a famous Little Albert experiment. So John Watson, based off the works of Ivan Pavlov, took classical conditioning to the next level. And what John Watson did was he experimented with this orphan, Little Albert, about 9 months old, and he placed a small white rat in Little Albert's lap. And at first, Little Albert was happy and fine and played with this little white rat, didn't have any issues at all. But Watson found that Albert was terrified of this really loud sound. And he took a piece of metal, he took a hammer, and he smashed the two things together. And little Albert started crying like crazy. So then with classical conditioning, John Watson, he just put these things together. The loud sound was an unconditioned stimulus, which produced the unconditioned response of fear. Then Watson paired the unconditioned stimulus, that loud sound, with the conditioned stimulus of the white rat. And then over time, when he'd pair those two things together, he'd give Albert the white rat, make the loud sound, give Albert the white rat, make the loud sound. Over time, what would happen was that white rat now became something that Albert feared. The white rat was the conditioned stimulus, fear was the conditioned response. And this taught us a few things about classical conditioning that we hadn't really thought about with Pavlov. Because unfortunately, Albert was not just afraid of the white rat. In fact, little Albert was afraid of all small, white, furry things. There's photos of John Watson putting on Santa Claus's mask. There's photos of little Albert with a little bunny rabbit in front of him. So what happened was Albert generalized. He became afraid of many different stimuli. When there are multiple conditioned stimuli, that's what we call generalization. Whereas if we become conditioned to just one specific stimulus, just one conditioned stimulus, that's what we call discrimination. So maybe you get attacked by a Chihuahua, and for the next 5 years, you are terrified of Chihuahuas, but you're not afraid of any other dog. Well, you have a very specific stimulus that produces a fear. And so we would say that that's discrimination. Maybe you eat a burrito from Initub and you get really sick. Well, if you avoid burritos from Initub, but you don't avoid burritos from Taco Bell, and maybe you don't avoid tacos from Initub, it's just the burrito from Initub, we would say that that's discrimination. There's one specific stimulus that is producing a response. So I hope that helps. It's a quick kind of run through of classical conditioning. And as always, if you have any questions, let me know. Good luck.